welcome back. Hope you all had a nice lunch, even if you were slightly confronted by the bizarre vegan lamb offering. David thought it was quite good. I think just eat vegetables. Anyway, hello, I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior research fellow at UK in a Changing Europe, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session, which is very forward-looking, and I think sort of, focusing on that opportunities part of the quadrant that Sarah and Jonathan presented in their earlier session. So we're looking at how can the UK make an economic success of net zero, and I think we'll also be wanting to explore the context of the actions that other big blocs are taking on net zero. Are we going to be crushed between the twin behemoths of the EU, the US, and with a lot of undercutting from China? Or is that just great news for consumers? Let's see where we get to. Anyway, so I've got a topo panel. My excellent panel consists of Tera, Allas. Tera was chief economist at what I always refer to as the business department, because that means I don't have to remember what it was called that year or those years. Tera is now director of research and economics at the McKinsey Global Institute. She's going to kick us off. And then I'm joined by two UKICE stars and stalwarts, Professor David Bailey, who is our resident petrol head, or more appropriately nowadays, battery head, who knows everything there is to know about the automotive industry, but also wider UK manufacturing. And then a repeat appearance, because you can't get enough of her, of Professor Sarah Hall, our deputy director, who is an expert on financial services and things like that. We're going to be focusing a lot about the role of services in delivering net zero and where the real opportunities are, whether we're well placed to doing them, and what that might mean in terms of policy. So to kick off, Tera has a presentation, I hope, and Tera, while she walks her way over to the podium to do her presentation, hopefully her slides will magically appear. That's called me making big hints. Yes, excellent. So Tera, over to you. Do please post your questions through Slido. I think we've probably done a bit more audience, and the people on Slido are all sitting there being a bit ignored. So I'm going to focus a lot on questions through Slido. So please try and make that technology work for you in this session. Tera.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jill, for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today to debate and discuss what is an incredibly important topic. How do we make an economic success out of the net zero transition? My simple answer to that is by understanding the nature of that opportunity and then making sure that the kinds of policies and policy principles we apply are aligned with that nature of the opportunity, rather than some kind of random or theoretical considerations. We possibly won't have an opportunity to get back to some of the questions around the costs of the net zero transition. So there are kind of two important points I want to make about that before I then move on to talk about the opportunity. And the first one is, of course, the ultimate point of net zero is to save the planet. And while we're today here talking about the opportunities that we might capture out of that transition, we mustn't forget about the number one priority, which is actually mitigate carbon emissions. And for the UK to contribute its share, both in terms of physical emission reductions, but also in terms of its soft power and influence over what happens in other countries and globally. And the second point to make about the costs is that they might not even be net negative, but they are certainly going to be felt very unevenly. And we will need policies not just to capture the opportunities, but also to share the costs in a fair way. And I'm sure there could be a whole seminar around that. That's an important kind of underpinning assumption that I'm making here when I make points about opportunities. Having said all of that, then what do I think the opportunities are, or what is the nature of the opportunities? Before we move on to talking about how we capture them, we need to understand what they actually look like. And I think there are kind of four characteristics which make me both optimistic about us being able to capture them, but also thoughtful about how we might go about it. So the first one is they are tangible. Secondly, they are very multifaceted, and possibly you could use even the word complex. They are global, and this is hugely important. and they are competitive. So what do I mean by tangible? Well, the first chart I'm going to show is actually about carbon emissions. It's not so much about the opportunities, but I think they are very, very linked. And I've just mentioned that this transition is going to be complex. It's a huge undertaking, and that could be scary. But the good news is that it's also kind of pretty concentrated. So if we look at the carbon emitters in this country, which is the right-hand bar here, or the column here, they're concentrated in a very small number of industries. And with the exception of agriculture, those are also industries that are very concentrated in terms of the number of businesses operating in them. So if you look at the left-hand chart, it's actually a very small percentage of all of the UK's 6 million businesses that are at the heart of this transition. I was on the policy advisory panel for the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget. And we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation which suggested that 40% of all of the emissions in the UK, direct emissions, Scope 1 emissions, are made by 300 businesses. So when I say tangible, what I mean is we can get together with those 300 businesses. This is not a number that's unmanageable. Policymakers and other stakeholders can get to know those businesses and work with them, together with them, to drive the transition. And, up to a point, they're also going to be at the core of capturing the opportunities. So yes, we're going to need very broad-based policies for households and for the other 6 million businesses, and regulations and standards and incentives, et cetera, but really, we can grasp the opportunity also through just targeting a handful of businesses and using them to help us understand, while not getting captured. That's obviously important as well. The opportunities that fall outside of those businesses then are going to be to do with both their supply chains and their customers and their broad kind of global presence. And another thing to note about these opportunities is that they're not just one thing. They are quite multifaceted. The CBI did a nice report on green growth last summer, which basically bucketed these opportunities into 3 broad areas, which you think, if you think about what's actually going to drive GDP growth when we think about net zero, well, first of all, investment. A lot of inward investment, but also local investment is going to need to go into the infrastructure, whether it's the grid, whether it's the offshore wind farms, whether it's the carbon capture and storage, whether it's specific hydrogen use cases. All of those investments will hopefully make the country more prosperous and create more productivity of one sort or another. A second huge opportunity is around exports. There will be areas in the zero carbon economy and the transition into it, where the UK has a comparative advantage. And I'll say a little bit more about those exports in a minute, but this could be things like undersea cables, it could be R&D or IP related to battery technologies or storage technologies. It could be various other products and services, which I'm sure my colleagues will also say a lot about. And then there's the cost savings. Actually, something like a third from the last cost curve that I have seen, carbon abatement cost curve, about a third of all of the carbon emission mitigation technologies were what I call in the money. In other words, the net present value was positive. We would save money by doing more energy efficiency, in many cases by shifting to electric vehicle fleets, in many cases by driving insulation and other types of policies, and in many cases just optimizing heating systems, optimizing transport systems by using software. And all of that 1/3 is probably a bigger number now because gas prices are still almost 2 times as high as they were 3 years ago. So gas, fossil fuel, is now expensive. That means all the other technologies should be even more cost saving. And we want to go after all of these opportunities. Personally, I think we particularly want to think carefully about how we go about the export opportunity. There's a lot of wishful thinking in this space, I would say, that would kind of conquer the world. But there are some really encouraging sets of facts and numbers to draw out. One way to think about this when we talk about the investment that's required for the net zero transition, or the cost involved in transitioning to a net zero economy, is that one person's cost is another person's revenue, broadly speaking. And so if all of those other countries out there are also going to be investing in nuclear power stations and offshore wind and new grid infrastructure and optimization systems, you know, we can sell stuff to them. And that's what the right-hand side of this chart is trying to convey. If we just focus on the opportunity here in the UK, we're going to be looking at about 3% of it. Because every other country in the world is going to be investing. And McKinsey Global Institute estimates about $4.5 trillion extra dollars a year of capital investment is going to be required to make the net zero transition. And so, you know, that investment means somebody's going to have to provide it and is going to be paid in order to provide it, and we'll make at the end of it some kind of a profit out of it, and we'll create some jobs around it. So that global lens is incredibly important. And when we look at globally, we need to think about competition. This isn't going to be a free-for-all. We can only sell those services to people if they're competitive and they're cost-effective and they're leading edge, and you know, we actually know what we're doing. This chart is just giving you a bit of an idea of the sort of size of the opportunity by sector. It's pretty simple. The x-axis is just looking at all of the capital expenditure in each country. How much of it is actually imported? So we're looking at this from the point of the UK being able to export to these countries and those countries importing it from somewhere else. So that's kind of global imports of capital goods on the x-axis by sector. And the y-axis, the horizontal, I always forget which is which, vertical axis is about the UK's comparative advantage in exports of capital goods and services. And it's well known that we don't have a comparative advantage in the vast majority of manufacturing sectors. Probably if you were to break down the huge big manufacturing bubble, there will be subsectors there where we do have advantages and should pursue them. What's important about this is that the service sectors, especially ICT and professional services, we have an incredible comparative advantage. We're the second largest services exporter in the world. And these services are just as important for building the power station. You need architects, you need project planners, you need financiers, you need engineers, you need R&D people, you need designers. All of these things are a huge opportunity of export. And when we talk about trade and exports, we often just focus on goods, but really, the opportunity is as much, if not more, on the services side. So these opportunities, they're tangible, they are multifaceted and global, and they are competitive. What does that mean for kind of policy guidelines or policy principles that we might want to apply? Well, first of all, we must think globally. So much of the debate is very much about, how do we supply the UK's steel industry with green hydrogen? Well, that's important, but that's not the global opportunity. So we need to be constantly thinking about global opportunities, and it's a global challenge, of course. I'm not going to say we need stable policy, because that is not realistic. There are a lot of unknowns about the costs and the pathways and the technology, let alone politics and citizen kind of appreciation of these issues. And so we cannot have a stable policy. What we can have is a stable vision of the known knowns. What are clearly going to be key building blocks of our net zero transition? Let's focus on those and build on those. We will need deep collaboration. This is not something that either the state or the markets can do on its own. And it's a system level issue, so it needs steering. We need to not just focus on the easy wins. Some of these things aren't going to cost initially money to invest in the future, and we must be willing to make those investments. And we need clarity around where markets work and can just get on with the job versus where intervention is required. And finally, it's a delivery challenge. You've been reading a lot about in the newspapers recently about the UK's patchy delivery record when it comes to infrastructure. Well, we need to get better at it. And that may require new types of bodies, or it may require new types of capabilities. It certainly requires a new type of mindset. So I'll finish off on an anecdote. I'm originally from Finland. I actually have been to Olkiluoto, which is the place where they finally now started the third nuclear reactor. It was supposed to come online like 2050, and it's now finally up and running, but I was there when they were constructing it. And they gave us a presentation about this project. And the project Gantt chart of the project plan had 120 years on it. Because that's how long these projects last. Not in terms of the building phase, hopefully, but the whole life cycle of these projects is hundreds of years. And so thinking about it in 6 months or in the electoral cycle or anything like that, it just doesn't make any sense. And we must get better at that kind of long-term planning and keep reminding ourselves that this is not about the next week, the next month, or the next year. This is about the next 100 years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tera. So I'm going to come back to you. So I'm going to put you on notice on how we get better at delivering infrastructure, since whatever, other than employing McKinsey to advise with 120-year Gantt charts. Quick question from Anonymous, which I'm going to phrase slightly more diplomatically, is where did the figure of 300 come from?
Oh, the 300 businesses. Yeah. It was an analysis of emissions by sector, which is easily available. Well, actually, emissions intensity for each unit of GVA, gross value added, how much emissions, and then a separate analysis of what proportion of businesses generate the GVA associated with these emissions. Okay. So it was an average emissions factor that we applied, but some of these sectors are you can look at the distribution of turnover and GVA and say, okay, 5 businesses make up 80% of the turnover in this business.
So it's a very concentrated picture in terms of big emissions. Thank you very much. That's a very useful setup. I would have said leave the slide of opportunities up, but then you'd all be denied the QR code to putting your questions through Slido. David, I'm going to turn to you, and you might want to pick up our top voted question. Do vote for questions from Thomas, who's just asking what is holding the UK government back from implementing an industrial strategy like the EU and the US. Is that necessary to make a success of net zero? So you might like to be thinking about that as you tell us about the industrial side of that, with that quite big manufacturing blob that we saw in Tera's chart.
Sure, no, that's a really good question. We don't have an industrial policy, is a simple answer to that. We heard about the need for it this morning from Michael Jacobs, and also in the SWOT analysis that kicked us off. We've actually had numerous industrial strategies since 2010. I've actually lost track of them all. I think I'm old enough now to remember at least 8 of them. The most recent decent one was developed by Greg Clark, where they made a huge effort to bring together sector, place and technology, but that was scrapped under the Boris Johnson government. In place of that came a Build Back Better plan with a focus on levelling up, but funding for local industrial strategies was ended, and most recently the local enterprise partnerships delivering that was scrapped. So a huge amount of institutional chopping and changing. Most recently, we had Liz Truss's very short-lived growth plan, outlived by a lettuce, obviously, and most recently Rishi Sunak's growth areas. So where are we? Well, we don't really have an industrial strategy, unlike the US, EU, China, which has just doubled down again on industrial strategy. And that's in stark contrast with elsewhere. It's been very heavily criticised by employers' associations. There's little in the way of a response to the US's various measures, including the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. UK initiatives to net zero tend to have lacked sufficient funding, have been pretty haphazard, and sometimes conflict with other areas of policy. So the Green Alliance, for example, have argued that there's a £14 billion shortfall in low-carbon infrastructure investment in the UK. We were hearing about the investment problem before lunch. Moreover, the windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas firms, rather bizarrely, covers some wind and solar electricity generators, therefore putting people off investing in renewables. And that's all counterproductive, because we do have areas where we do have a competitive strength. We've just heard about them. I would add in modular nuclear, offshore wind, fantastic research on batteries, for example. If we think about offshore wind, we've not leveraged that into building stronger supply chains, and that's been a really missed opportunity. So, what could we do? Actually having an industrial policy would be a start. So if you take one thing away from this, let's have a policy. Jeremy Hunt said he would wait and see what the EU is doing in terms of its industrial policy before responding. But why? I mean, one of the arguments put forward for Brexit was that EU state aid rules restricted our ability to be flexible and nimble in the way that you were talking about, Sarah, this morning, in terms of supporting technologies and firms in the UK. And yet the position since Brexit has been very much to sit on the sidelines, scrap industrial policy, and watch the action unfold elsewhere. For example, in terms of building gigafactories. Now, last year, some interesting things started to happen. So we've got the beginnings of some elements of an industrial policy, but kind of secret and under the radar. And I think the government doesn't want to talk about it too much because it might upset the right-wingers in the Conservative Party. So we've now got these 5 growth areas. There was extra support put up for the automotive sector, particularly in terms of the shift towards electric cars, because the previous money had been used up. We've got a critical minerals strategy and the beginnings of a battery strategy. In full disclosure, I sat on the task force that advised on that. That's all welcome, but it doesn't add up to a strategy, and the sums on offer are a fraction of what's available in the US, the EU and China. So we don't join things up. The Labour Party, as we know, initially came up with a £28 billion a year green transition programme. It's rowed back on that. It's now an aspiration over 2 parliaments if conditions allow, and if it can stay within those fiscal rules that we were hearing about earlier. Now, I can understand Labour's caution in the run-up to a general election, but we do need substantial investment in the UK, for example, to deliver on energy security on the way to net zero. And so Labour, or whoever is coming into government, need a credible plan that the money is going to be well spent if financial markets are going to finance borrowing. If we come up with a good plan and we can spell out the return, I think the financial markets will back it. What they're not going to do is back unfunded tax cuts, as we saw with the Truss mini-budget. You know, we are not the United States. So there are huge opportunities, I think. We've heard about some of them. Progress depends on new investment in infrastructure, electric vehicle charging points. I drove here yesterday, just about managed to find a charger. High-speed broadband, hydrogen technology, where we're also really good. It isn't about picking winners, but about nurturing the stables from which successful carbon technologies can emerge. Also, a couple of final points. A lot of these opportunities are in the north of England, so it could support in terms of levelling up. Secondly, industrial policy today and industrial strategy isn't about top-down. And we saw during the pandemic good and bad industrial policy examples in terms of scaling up ventilator production, because we needed ventilators, we didn't have enough. When the government said, here's the plan for a ventilator, go and build it, everybody fell over laughing because it was something from the 1960s. When government worked with business collectively to think about how we can scale up production of modern machines, that worked extremely well. We've also seen a partnership approach in automotive and in aerospace. So that's about bringing different actors together, identifying opportunities, identifying the potential constraints and developing policy to overcome that. So we need much more of a partnership approach. Final point, we heard earlier about how we live in a very centralised country in some senses. Some of the work we're doing for UK and Change in Europe is looking at the idea of just transition. We've looked at the North East and the West Midlands, really different perspectives of workers in those 2 regions about possibilities to transition, for example, towards electric batteries. So we need much more of a regional focus and a regional industrial policy to do this. And it's about bringing technology, sectors and places together. We had just begun to do that in the Greg Clark industrial strategy, and then sadly it was scrapped. So one of the problems we've got, as we heard earlier, is that we've got a highly centralised administrative system in the UK, which means we don't have that sort of regional industrial policy in place. Just to give you one example, GKN, automotive supplier, they make the driveline connecting the power with the wheels. They shut last year their driveline plant in Birmingham, even though Innovate UK had backed a lot of new technology to go into electric cars. Those drive lines are now going to be made in Italy and Poland. Partly that was a Brexit story because of the complications of managing their supply chain. One thing about that closure was that there was a chance to think about, okay, what skills do those workers have? What could we diversify that into? Heat pumps, turbines, gearboxes for turbines. But we had no organisation. We no longer have the Manufacturing Advisory Service. We do not have a regional development agency to actually do that. The plant's shut and it's now a retail park. So I think there are great opportunities, but we need to have an industrial policy and we need to think about really empowering the regions to push that forward.
Can I just ask you one, that's very interesting, David. Can I just ask you one very sort of current question, which is some people are suggesting that steel making in South Wales is being sacrificed on the altar of net zero, that the government's paying a whole bunch of money and costing 3,000 jobs, whereas you would expect to support jobs, and that UK will be the only leading industrialised country without virgin steel capacity because we're just making steel out of recycled steel. I mean, you know, wouldn't industrial policy give you a different answer on steel making in South Wales?
It would at least look at the opportunities and the possibilities. So Port Talbot's interesting because it's thought to emit 5% of our carbon emissions. So coming back to your point about being hugely concentrated, I think the issue there is just going for electric arc furnaces to get CO2 down means we can't produce virgin steel. At the moment, electric arc furnaces can't produce very high quality steel for things like automotive and some other sectors. So there is a risk. The technology might develop, but equally, in the meantime, once that blast furnace has closed, we will be importing virgin steel from somewhere else where it's made potentially in an even more carbon intensive manner. So I think a more thought through transition could have been useful, looking at, for example, using hydrogen to repower the blast furnaces.
Thank you very much, David. There are lots more questions coming in. Thank you, David. And Sarah, your blobs weren't as big, but they were there as well in the sort of, you know, both the financial and also the sort of more general business services. So what's the services opportunity as the UK poising itself well to take them?
Great, thanks Jill. I'm actually going to speak largely about financial services, although I do totally take the point that's been made a couple of times that the UK, excuse me, the UK is a sort of services powerhouse, particularly in business and professional services. But I'm just going to talk about financial services. So on the face of it, there's quite a lot of opportunity in terms of net zero and the green transition when it comes to green finance, if you like. I think perhaps most notably, London is regularly ranked and has been ranked for the past 4 years as the leading green financial centre internationally. And the government has set out an objective to make London the first globally net zero aligned financial centre. And there might be some questions about how you would know or what it would look like to have a net zero aligned financial centre, and I'll maybe come back on those. So what is the role of green finance in the types of activities that we've been hearing about? I think the key thing to think about, and both speakers have mentioned this, is that there's a significant need for ideally low-cost capital and capital that will facilitate scale-up capacity to support the net zero transition. And so having a large liquid financial centre within your jurisdiction should be really helpful in doing that. And I think there are two specific ways that works. One is that if you have kind of green reporting requirements, for example, you're essentially asking businesses to align their decision making with sustainability requirements. So that's a sort of corporate angle on it. I think as well it's important to note that when you look at consumer surveys in relation to green finance, consumers tend to be very supportive. Recent work by the Financial Conduct Authority suggests that around 75% of consumers actually expect this within financial services products. And I think for the UK in particular, there's a sort of macroeconomic political point about the fact that you could use the growth in green finance to bolster the UK's position as a leading financial services provider. So that's sort of what we're aiming for. And there's been a lot of activity really rather recently to get us there. If you think that the first financial services product, the first green bond, was launched in 2007, there's now a whole raft of financial products aimed at helping to facilitate this transition. In terms of what the government has done, and then specifically as Jill's asked us to think about what could be done, I think the most important recent intervention comes in the form of the Green Finance Strategy in 2019, which was really aimed at these twin goals of trying to use finance to align private sector activity and business decision making with sustainable growth on the one hand, and then on the other hand using this strategy to use green finance to support the competitiveness of UK financial services. And this is an area, there's been a lot of sort of policy uncertainty, and we've heard quite a lot about this on this panel. But this has actually been an area of quite concerted focus, I would say. And indeed, this strategy was updated significantly just last year, really focusing a lot more on what's included within green finance, so a desire to incorporate nature and processes of transition, rather like David was speaking about, rather than sort of green activities in and of themselves. So far this sounds positive. There's a sort of clear political support for green finance. We know that the UK is a financial services strength, and we know that therefore that should be helpful in terms of realising the low-cost capital that the sector would need. There are a couple of quite significant challenges, if you like, that I think, however, the UK government needs to be aware of. Clearly, the first is that it's not just the UK that is interested in green finance. And when you look at the ranking of green financial centres, it's really notable that this is an area of significant activity within the EU. So, London may be ranked 1, but I think it's about 4 or 5 of the next 10 are within the EU. So the UK can't afford to rest on its laurels. And this really matters because one of the big questions in financial services and green finance is how are you going to define what counts as green? And it's called a taxonomy. It's basically a rule that says this is going to allow you to determine, say, yep, this counts as green. The EU has already set out its rules in this area. The UK currently isn't set on what its rules are going to be, and this is probably one of the biggest things that I would suggest if if the question is what should the government do, this is an area to think about. So the UK's green taxonomy, as it's called, is aimed at taking advantage of domestic regulatory control outside of the EU, i.e. better tailoring it to the needs of the UK. And that's welcomed by the sector, but the sort of delay and running behind the EU is much more of a problem.
So Sarah, I'm going to butt in. I want to ask you a question. Is the UK going to maximise its advantage by differentiating itself from the EU, or is this an area where actually it really ought to just converge? Diverge, converge.
Big question, Jill, and I think our colleague Joel Relland, who writes the divergence tracker, would be the man to ask. But I would say I think there's an increasing recognition that when it comes to the green transition, and indeed the whole question of meeting net zero targets, it's transboundary, it crosses boundaries. And so if you're imposing additional costs on investors by them needing to comply with different regulatory regimes, that's probably going to be a disincentive to investment. And that actually very helpfully, Jill, brings me on to my my 3 recommendations, if I can get into my laptop. So areas where I think the UK needs to focus attention or questions that need to be asked. And helpfully these actually really echo what Tera and David said, but in a different sector. So the first is that having clear long-term national net zero policies and incentives, as well as a regulatory environment, is very helpful to investors. It helps investors plan and it helps them make decisions. So the sorts of things that David was talking about are equally of value to financial services. The second one is also something that David mentioned in relation to manufacturing, which is I think it's really important to have dialogue between regulators, firms in financial services, and particularly corporates and SMEs in the sorts of sectors that David works in, to understand what their requirements are. And this is important because it might help prevent greenwashing, which is the risk here, in terms of products being labelled as green when actually they're not, put simply. So I think a dialogue between those different communities it would be really helpful. And then I think the third area which is important to keep alive is a good engagement with other jurisdictions. And the research would suggest that actually a degree of global convergence, or what's called interoperability in this area, would be helpful in terms of financing the green transition, but there are kind of political questions overlaid on top of that.
Sarah, that's all very interesting. Now I've got a question which I swear to everybody I'm not pretending to be called Andrew, but it is probably exactly the sort of question I would ask. And I would say Jill would always ask a machinery of government question. So I'm going to put to all of you, what, or indeed are there institutional structures, what institutional structures might enable an industrial, or actually a coherent industrial finance strategy with a shelf life of a decade, or if you want to take Tera's example, a shelf life of a century. But let's start with a decade, because more than a year would be helpful. Tera, you're an ex-bureaucrat. Industrial structures?
Interesting.
Or just left to the whim of whichever minister's at the desk.
No,
that day.
I have written down here institutional makeup is really important. This was basically, as I was listening to both David and Sarah, this kind of is the thought that you end up having. I don't know what the exact correct institutional makeup is, because there's a big challenge here if you think about just organizational terms. It's a complex transition. And on one hand, you need it to be systemic. You need all the parts to be joined up, as David says. But on the other hand, if you're just constantly joining up, you're actually not ever going to get anything done. So on the other hand, it needs to be quite bottom-up, specific opportunities on the ground in specific locations with local people getting together and just delivering. In the context of uncertainty, where we're not sure what the costs are going to be, or what the benefits are going to be, or what the global system of agreements is going to look like, or whatever. I think my only kind of practical answer to that is something that McKinsey has called strategy under uncertainty, which is identify the no regrets and go after them really relentlessly. So obviously the problem is we can't agree on what the no regrets are, but I think we could get 80% of people to agree on what they are. Grid reinforcements, okay, or, electric vehicle fleets, what have you. And sort of start there and make sure that those are delivering, and then deal with the rest of the complexity on a really agile basis. Don't promise to people policy stability if it cannot exist. Because I can guarantee one thing: oil prices and gas prices are going to go up as well as down. And every time they go down, there's going to be plenty of people shouting about how this low carbon technology is very expensive. Well, in the scheme of 100 years, this almost certainly isn't. So one has to kind of remain strategic. And so institutions that have that strategic capability to deliver a strategy under uncertainty, I think, is what we need.
David, we've had industrial strategy councils, which I think were dubbed by email. Yep. We've had a levelling up advisory council, which that's still meeting. Andy Haldane probably does it on his own. Yes. So do we need sort of institutional change, or are you happy with the current system?
No, I think we do. And I think the point about strategy is really well made, because clear direction of travel is really important for businesses who are going to do most of the heavy lifting. So they want to see the direction of travel. That's why we need an industrial strategy. That helps them in terms of confidence to invest. It de-risks the investment, and we get more investment the way we're going. 3 quick suggestions. One is, I think, and we made this argument in our 2015 book, An Industrial Policy for the UK, which is having a statutory industrial strategy commission. So it has a basis that is responsible for delivering this long term. Secondly, we need to bring back a regional scale in the UK beyond just the combined authorities, because things need to be done in places. And thirdly, we could really scale up the UK Infrastructure Fund. There was a great report from UK in a Changing Europe about that. That was meant to plug the gaps with us not now being able to access the European Investment Bank, but it's really small scale, and that UK Infrastructure Fund could be used to co-finance some of this and lever in private sector funding.
That report is available downstairs. I'm sure David's book is available at your best online book retailer. Sarah?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I am not a machinery of government expert, but I do know someone who is. But I think I would say three things. So I think one challenge is that sometimes financial services becomes a little carved off in terms of UK government policy making within Treasury. And I think in terms of financing a green transition, we need to be much better at embedding financial services alongside manufacturing and also crucially actually alongside other service sectors. So that would be the first challenge. The second point I would make, and the next two really refer back to what I said earlier, the second point I'd make is that I think whatever institutional framework is set up, it needs to engage regularly and deeply with market participants to understand what's going on, so more of a sort of ecology type approach. And the thirdly is that I think it needs, just as it needs to be cognizant of domestic regional issues, I think it also needs to be really alive to the changing international regulatory and policy arena.
Do you think that the Industrial Strategy Council Commission should cover financial services? I mean, does it make sense? Is it a bit, frankly, old-fashioned to think of industrial strategy as being?
Industrial strategy isn't just about manufacturing, it's about services
so
that are going to be
services,
successful as well.
all right, excellent. Okay, just to clarify. I've got loads of questions coming in. We've focused obviously on the opportunities, but lots and lots of questions about costs and risks. So who have I got here? I've got Ade Farnham, I'm not sure which. How do we best ensure transition is fair and avoid the problems of France, Gilets jaunes, and the Gilets verts, or whatever they're calling themselves now, Dutch farmers, etc. From Anonymous, what about the transition requiring mass extraction of minerals from countries where we might not like being dependent on those? I think the UK has just produced a critical minimum strategy. And actually another one from Anonymous, who may be the same Anonymous, which is, actually, what about the carbon intensity of the transition itself? We've got to build loads and loads of kit using, largely non-decarbonised power supplies to do all that. So, where would you see, Tera, where would you see the sort of big risks, and how can government start thinking about managing those risks, whether they're on security of supply, which we saw come back against on energy when energy security started to trump net zero, but in other areas, and how do we sort of manage the sort of popular side of this, or possibly the unpopular side of it?
Those are all incredibly big questions to which I don't have all the full answers. I think the just transition, I understand that there's a whole set of work going on around that, and I'm not an expert on it. The clear answer to that is that everything else needs, we want a fair society, and so this is a kind of a question of redistribution or pre-distribution or whatever you want to call it, and that just needs to be worked up in a way that does compensate those people who might lose from this transition. That sounds obvious. I haven't seen the numbers, but my gut feel is that those costs are not so enormous that we wouldn't be able to somehow compensate people for it. And it's no different from the way that we've supported people with the energy crisis, or we've supported people in COVID or whatever. It just is a slower moving target, so harder for politicians to kind of come up with the policies on the spot, but there are ways in which we can deal with it. It does require, as has been pointed out by both Sarah and David, a lot of dialogue and a lot of engagement. It's not like somebody in Whitehall is going to know what the right answer is, or the answer that's going to feel right to people. On the other risks, sure, like any strategy and plan needs to do a risk analysis of what are the possible worlds in which we might find ourselves and build in enough resilience. and extra capacity to deal with those. I'm an economist, so I'm broadly skeptical of believing that in the long term we can't just kind of get whatever materials we need. If we run out of one material, scientists will come up with another solution. It might be more expensive in the short run, but we'll manage, kind of thing. It's just building the optionality into your plan so you're not stuck in a very, very narrow kind of set of solutions.
That's not an assume a can opener response. Assume there will be a nicely substitutable critical mineral for the one that's whose
I'm not
supply has just
assuming
been
it'll
shut
be
off.
available off the shelf for as cheaply as, just like, natural gas used to be a lot cheaper and we were using it all over the place. Prices went up by 8 times. We stopped using it for fertilizers. We stopped using it for various different chemicals that can be made out of natural gas, but also other stuff. The other stuff would have looked super expensive 5 years ago, and now it suddenly looked cheap. I think we should expect this kind of volatility and not get sidetracked by it into kind of short-term decisions.
David, I think the UK government's put out its first critical minerals strategy a couple of weeks ago, and you mentioned you're also doing work on just transition. So is that sort of covering off these sorts of risks to the sort of seamless transition to net zero? Are we there yet?
No, it's a start. We do need to think through the equity impacts of the transition. If we think about what's happened so far, for example, with electric cars, I'm lucky enough to live in a nice neighbourhood. We've all got drives. We can charge at home. A lot of the people have their own businesses or have pensions or can do salary sacrifice. So they've got all the tax breaks. So well-off people have been given a whole load of tax breaks to get into electric cars. Go to a poorer part of the neighbourhood around the corner, you don't see any because the upfront cost is too high. They can't charge at home, so the VAT rates mean it's much more expensive. So some countries, like New Zealand, have low interest rate loans to enable low-income, middle-income people to access the technology. We need to start thinking about that much more. In terms of critical minerals, one of the big issues is that China really dominates in terms of its control of the supply chain and the processing. So there's a big issue there. The US is particularly concerned about that in terms of its Inflation Reduction Act in decoupling from China, as is the European Union. So they're looking for alternative sources. One of the big things is we're going to have to recycle much more. So a circular economy approach to batteries and battery materials will be absolutely critical. We're very good at that in the UK, potentially. And I think I take the point. There is a lot of work, including here in the UK, going into making batteries made out of more abundant materials. So those technologies will come. They'll be more expensive to begin with, but with experienced economies, the cost will come down.
Sarah?
Yeah, so I think the risks, specifically for financial services, are around greenwashing and the risk particularly, I think, actually to consumer confidence in green finance as a result of that. I'd maybe just draw on a couple of examples from some research we're doing at the moment in the rural North Midlands of England, where we're engaging with people on the cost of living crisis. I think there's 2 points that are quite relevant here. One is that, and David's really alluded to this, that, if you speak, we've been, conducting focus groups with people about the cost of living, and one thing that comes out quite strongly, even without being asked, is that they can't afford or don't want to pay the higher upfront costs associated with, for example, charging cars, electric cars, etc. So I think there's an affordability question. And I think there might also be a planning and NIMBYism question here. So the area that we're conducting research in is the subject to planning permission for 3 large solar farms. And it's amazing how strongly that is coming out in the research as something that people don't want in their neighbourhood. And I think this comes back to the sort of relationship between local planning and central government strategy and how you deal with that.
So that's really interesting because we've got various concerns being expressed about the UK ditching a relatively reliable energy infrastructure for a potentially less reliable one. And Peter Hurst has just asked, we've just written a statement, but with a question on the end, so I'm going to interpret it as a question. A bundle of green investment infrastructure structures. Tera, you were mentioning this sort of big delivery challenge about that. How, the UK's track record isn't particularly reassuring that we can manage a massive thing, both on actually physically getting the stuff there, but also on the skills where we've had to list construction as a shortage profession, we don't have a ready supply of people to come in. UK Borders Agency had to set up a separate operation to accredit people to come in and work on the Olympic part, which is nothing like the scale of that we're talking about now for energy infrastructure. So actually, if we build it, but can we build it? What do we need to do to be able to do that in terms of skills policy, in terms of planning and all of these things?
Another huge question. I have to say I think we can do it. And why do I say that? It is because 10, 15 years ago I was working on energy and climate change policy, and I was very skeptical that we would deliver the sort of offshore wind farms that we currently now have, and more than what we thought we would have. There was all sorts of reasons why the supply chains weren't going to be there, incentives weren't there, the finance wasn't there, the manufacturing wasn't there, the capabilities and skills, whatever. But we have actually delivered an incredible growth in offshore wind farms. So I think if we have the right aligned policies, then we can deliver this. But it comes back to what David was saying earlier, which is so difficult to do. It needs to be joined up. So I have a page in one of my industrial strategy presentations which lists all the policies that would need to be aligned in order for the delivery of whatever industrial policy you do have, let's say net zero. And it's not just about, let's say, tax breaks or subsidies. It's obvious things like R&D, but definitely very quickly it's planning, it's skills, it's immigration policy. It is, in fact, pretty much every policy under the sun suddenly becomes an important policy to deliver net zero. What's difficult about that is that the government has more targets than not just net zero, right? There's, all kinds of priorities. And I think we often use the COVID period as an example of, look, we were able to deliver the vaccine. We were able to deliver it because it was number one priority for absolutely everyone, absolutely everywhere. And so we need to create a similar kind of pressure almost, and alignment and focus on the net zero and sustain it. I don't know exactly how to do that. I think it will have to come from the political class ultimately, because otherwise it is going to be diffuse and we aren't going to get that join up between different departments and different delivery agencies.
I mean, David, businesses already complain about a lot of the problems that, grid connections where you wait for ages. I think the government announced it was doing bits about that, but actually, what do we need to do, and is there enough conversation about the people side, the skills, the jobs and things like that, as well as the sort of harder kit?
Yeah, good question. So we do have an infrastructure commission, which is doing an excellent job highlighting a lot of these issues. It's about follow through in terms of changing planning law, so you can actually get the power supply into where it's needed, say a motorway service station to put charging points in, and the financing to actually make that happen. So we need to join that up around what the Infrastructure Commission is saying. On skills, we've got really two big challenges. We've got net zero coming. We've also got what's called Industry 4.0, the whole agenda around automation, digitisation, which is going to destroy a whole load of jobs and create a whole load of other jobs. Some countries are very good at this. I've been working out in Singapore. They have a skills future program between the government, business, trade unions to identify the future skills and fund it so that people are retrained throughout their lives. And that's something we've got to do in the UK. Also, devolving skills down to a regional level would be good. At the moment, businesses don't like paying the skills levy because they just see it as a tax and they've got no say about how it's used. Let's devolve that down to city mayors.
Sarah?
I don't actually have anything to add.
Excellent. That's a very good answer. So you've all been very patient while I've indulged the people who didn't come. So if there isn't roving mic, my eyesight's not good enough, and particularly anyone at the back who wants to ask a genuine quick question, who hasn't asked a question before. Somebody halfway up, a couple of people here. If there are any women who'd like to ask questions, she said. Women are allowed to ask questions too. Yes, we've got a couple of people. Do I have a mic? Has my mic taken the day off because he thought I wasn't going to use it? You'll have to shout. That means I'll repeat it because otherwise people listening online won't be able to hear. So.
First, I want to thank the chairman from the Porters and Professor Lennon and all the UKICE members for today's event. Well organised, and thank you very much. You should not be taking time. Now, I've got two questions, but I've got a long lead up, so I'm pressing to ask them But if I made your as I you're representing an Institute of Government Application, right?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Because you're representing of the Institute of Government, that will be later if I may, because my question is in terms of history and leads up to the present day, so it won't be fair to take up time asking you.
Okay, well, let's go forward then. Yeah, John, is that you? She said. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, okay, I'm having to go. Yeah, you.
If I was going on back to net zero and staying green, I haven't heard before today, any other events, I haven't heard even anything today about the fact where all these resources coming from. I haven't heard anything about the fact that no one's mentioning BRICS nations. Why is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and so many other countries clubbing together, saying to the G7, you want to divest from fossil fuels? Good luck. We're going to do our own thing. Without us, you have no green New Deal.
That's a great question. We've got some questions on Slido about should we actually be talking about degrowth and things like that. But I think this is really interesting. You know, somebody was asking about, you know, why was there assumption that these export markets would be available to us? And I think a really interesting thing about actually, you know, the West caused the climate problem, or whatever, you know, other countries in the road to develop might not want to be part of the sort of consensus way we're going at. Tera, you're with the McKinsey Global Institute, so you know, are we being unrealistic about this as a joint world activity, and actually will the BRICS go a different route and maybe, you know, take their own path?
Yes, I mean, there are sort of two different ways to look at this. I do recognise that it's hugely challenging. This is a global collective action problem. And by definition, like, we haven't, to this date, as a human race, come up with any sort of box standard solution to those problems. It requires a lot of persuasion and collaboration and convincing people that it's worth all of us trying to do something about it, and we will not succeed 100%. I think if we aim for perfection, we're going to fail, for absolute certainty. In the meanwhile, I come back to my point about no regrets. Even if the BRICS countries do something else, there are tons of things we can be doing which are beneficial to us, even in the worst scenarios of what those other countries might get up to. So let's identify them and go after them, while we obviously continue to try and convince everyone to join the carbon reduction targets that are required to essentially save the planet. There will not be all markets available to us, and indeed there will be supply chains that we don't want to be reliant on, because we do not live in a perfect world of open markets and lack of geopolitics, etc., etc. But equally, I think that is exaggerated. The McKinsey Global Institute did recently publish a report that looks at not just the geographic but geopolitical distance of imports and exports in the world, and where, you know, basically it's a mixed economy in many and most cases. You know, if you can only get a certain thing from a certain country, you will figure out a way to get it. You might have to pay more, you might have to give up something else in terms of your negotiation position. But it's not like you're done and you won't be able to move ahead with this plan. So I would encourage us not to be black and white, because it's going to be messy. But the fact that it's messy doesn't mean it's important. In fact, it's the reason why we need lots of different brains and lots of different collaborators to deliver it, because there isn't going to be a simple answer to any of this.
David, you mentioned a bit about the circular economy, but don't we need to accept that we're in a resource-constrained world and we actually don't have most of the resources and dependent on others, and maybe we should just accept that that means that we don't grow anymore, whatever, and let other parts of the world enjoy the benefits we enjoyed over the last couple of centuries.
So there has been this debate around degrowth. I prefer to think about it in terms of A-growth, i.e. being agnostic to it. That is, let's set our objectives for net zero, what we want to achieve. If we can grow, brilliant. In fact, if we can grow, it'll generate the tax to pay for it. We shouldn't be aiming to degrow, because there'll be all sorts of consequences from that. But let's try and think less about GDP. Think about some of the other things that we need to make. We've said since the 1960s, GDP isn't a great measure of development. let's think about other things as well. One final point, just to, on your point, is one really interesting thing that's happening in the EU and also the UK is carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that's already started, and companies are having to account for the carbon that they use in their production process.
Isn't this just green protectionism? That's another question I'm throwing in from Slido.
I think it's legitimate in the sense, within the European Union, within the UK, we have increased the price of carbon. What has resulted from that is some manufacturing has moved elsewhere to make things at lower prices as the price of carbon. So we've had this carbon leakage. So to give EU manufacturing, UK manufacturing a chance, this carbon border adjustment mechanism is coming in. That's going to have some profound implications for world trade. It'll be interesting to see how that works out, whether you've got a part of the world trade system that engages with those countries that have a CBAM system, low-cost carbon, and others that don't.
Okay, Sarah, I'm going to throw you a completely different question. We have, as all questions about the climate transition do, spent 59 minutes talking about getting to net zero. We haven't talked at all about adapting to already locked-in climate change. I just wondered, how far is that a risk to the financial services sector? Is it an opportunity, sort of, increasing insurance claims and things like that? What thinking's going on there about adaptation?
So, there's absolutely fascinating research looking at profound changes in the insurance sector, particularly around climate change-induced risks, and particularly work on the flooding sector is really, really interesting. I think it is a risk. I think the sort of broader direction of travel is to think not just about endpoints, but to think about processes of transition, and that by very nature takes into account where you're starting from. So I'd be quite supportive of that kind of more life cycle approach. But the short answer is yes, in insurance, definitely. Profound changes. There's also, I think, closer to home or more immediately, the sorts of things that David has been speaking about actually is now coming through into kind of retail insurance issues and debates. So one of the big issues, I think, around electric car uptake in the UK is actually insurance, personal insurance costs because of battery costs. So I think that's actually a really good example of how manufacturing and services are not separate. They're like two sides of the same coin.
Okay, well that's given us quite a quick global tour of the challenges of net zero with a mention of adaptation. So could I just ask you all to join me in thanking our fantastically excellent panel.
Thank you, Chair.